Well, Kamal, I'm back. You're looking very dapper. Your suit and tying it up. What's happened to the knitwear in my absence?
Well, I'm mixing between the suit and the roll necks,
Yes.
as you know. And given that you were back today and you are actually in a resplendent roll neck, I thought I'd mix it up a bit with a tie for this special occasion of welcoming you back to the Daily Tea.
Well, thank you very much indeed for having me back in the studio. I have missed you. You've done very well, though, with Gordon and Tim and all of our great contributors.
Battling a sore throat at times, but we managed to get through.
You lost your voice somewhere in Parliament Square last week, I think, which was good fun. And readers will know that I've had a bit of a tricky time because I lost my beloved stepmother, Bernice, on November the 6th. So I've been off on compassionate leave, and it makes me tear up because she was somebody who loved this podcast. In fact, when she was in hospital and we were kind of having to gather her phone, I was looking back on her history and just checking her messages, who'd been in touch, maybe they didn't know. And in the history were all episodes of the Daily Tea that she had racked up to listen to, even though she was very unwell. And it does lead us nicely into a discussion about assisted dying. We both ended up writing on the same subject this weekend, which doesn't always happen. We're talking about assisted dying because there is this monumental vote on Friday deciding whether we should allow people to take their own lives. We're voting in this country on the prospect of euthanasia. So I had to come back to work on Friday. We'd had the funeral on Thursday, which thankfully had gone very well. And our overwhelming feeling about my poor stepmother's demise was how lucky we were for her to have ended up in the Peace Hospice in Watford, which is our local hospice from hospital. And I made the point in my column that I can't quite understand why the government is ploughing all of this time, attention and debate into assisted dying, when what they should be doing is looking to fund hospice care more generously. So that hospice, and Bernice was there from the Sunday to the Wednesday that she passed away. I incidentally was still in America covering Trump, so it was all rather traumatic. And thank you to Louisa, our executive producer, for holding my hand through what was a very difficult process before flying back. And that hospice experience was transformative, not just for her, but for my father and my brothers. And when they were telling me just how wonderful it had been to speak to one point of contact, to have a palliative care consultant take them through every step of the way, literally hand in hand, to have the environment of the inpatient unit there, which is much more comforting than, frankly, having discussions with doctors and nurses in hospital corridors. I'm a massive fan of the NHS. My father worked for it for years. The NHS saved Bernice's life on a couple of occasions, so I have no great criticism of them. But they're not particularly good at palliative care because they don't have the time and resources. We spoke to Esther Ranson about this at the very beginning of this debate, and she said, well, I'm just advocating to have a good death. And as good as deaths can be, this hospice one was good because she was surrounded by her family and she was comfortable throughout the process of her being there. So that was the point that I was trying to land in my column. I'm concerned, like you are, that this has been rushed. But the point is, and I've some sympathy with the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, he's right to say that we can't rush into this unless we get end-of-life care in this country sorted. That hospice gets 14% of funding from government. Not enough people can access it. Bernice was desperately ill, and even she had to go onto a waiting list. Beds are in short supply. They're hugely dependent on fundraisers, your marathon runners, your people who shop at hospice charity shops and all the rest of it. Those figures have tanked because of cost of living crisis and all the rest of it. They're not exempt from the national insurance contribution rise, so they're in quite difficult financial straits anyway. They have to deal with higher energy bills. It's not been a good time for the hospice sector, and my main argument was in the column, don't focus on that, giving people ways to die. Focus on funding ways for them to die with more dignity.
So all of us send us our love to you, Camilla, to your family, to all your loved ones. It's been a very tough time for you, but it was your piece at the weekend, which actually then led to my piece, because reading your piece, which is so moving and makes all the points that you've just made very powerfully, this is a conversation about dignity in death. It's not actually a conversation, as you say, about assisted dying. And it's about giving people another option beyond suicide, Switzerland, or suffering. That is what people are offered at the moment, because suffering because of the lack of palliative care, because of the lack of end-of-life care, are people being obliged to look at the option of assisted dying because there is no alternative? And my column really, building on a lot of the arguments you made, I actually am in a position where I am still unsure what I think about assisted dying. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? But my argument was the mechanism which this government have allowed this to be debated, the private members bill, is simply not robust enough for such an important issue. Although these issues are called conscience issues, I find that a rather odd phrase. It is also a very practical and very vital issue about funding, about how we think about the NHS, how we think about hospice care. Are they able to deliver the new service, which would be assisted dying? So although it's called a conscience issue, it could still be a government bill, as the human and embryology bill, which had a lot of ethical issues in it in the early 2000s, was still a free vote. So people could still vote depending on their conscience. The government didn't say it had to be a whipped vote. You had to vote for it. And that was talking about very early stage life, what research should be possible at the embryo stage, what help could be possible at the embryo stage. And this raised some very significant issues, particularly for religious groups, about when does life really start. And the government at that stage, Labour government, because of that controversy over the issue of the human embryology bill, said people can have a free vote, even if you're in the government. And that was the right approach, because it meant that there was proper resources put into the discussion, which a private members bill simply doesn't allow. Kim Leadbeater, who is the MP proposing this bill, has been left to make all the arguments. It's a campaigning argument. To be very honest, it's rather amateurish. You know, you're leaving MPs to look at Google, and there's no research done by the government or any expertise provided. And do you remember, Camilla, when we interviewed Wes Streeting in that very powerful podcast we did, which I would say to everyone, just go back and listen to on where you get your podcasts or on the Telegraph website. Wes Streeting spoke about his own faith, but he also said, I want to throw open the doors of the Department of Health and Social Care so people have the evidence about what this issue is about. That simply hasn't happened. And what we're going to get on Friday when this vote comes is MPs voting on a matter of such significance. We are crossing a very significant Rubicon here, as significant as the vote in 1967 to legalise abortion. It may or may not be the right decision, but surely this has to be a process. And I said in my column that the government should set up a judge-led inquiry which reports in a year, which gives all the latest evidence, which discusses hospice care, which I think has seen Hospice UK as saying that many, many millions of pounds have been taken out of hospice care because the funding for hospice care has simply not kept up with inflation. It takes account of all the evidence, and then you have proper, lengthy debate like you'd have for a budget, which goes over days and days and days. This is going to be given 5 hours on Friday.
It's ridiculous. And actually, the journey that Wes Streeting has been on is almost the kind of conversation that we all have to nationally emulate over the course of the next weeks and months to get to the point that we're in a position to comment on this. Let's just listen to what he told you on the Daily Tea. That was back during the election campaign. Let's listen to that first of all.
I am uncharacteristically conflicted. I voted in favour of the assisted dying bill at second reading last time. Firstly, I thought it was really important to have the debate, and I felt that there are 2 dimensions to the assisted dying debate. There's the principled argument, and then there's the practicalities argument. On the principled case, I have lost friends and family to diseases that have created excruciating pain and low to no quality of life towards the end. And there have been moments where I've been by the bedside of someone I love thinking, if only there were a way we could end this suffering. And I think that's where the case for assisted dying comes from. There is, by the way, a moral, ethical, religious argument that says it is not our place to end someone's life in that way. As an Anglican, I have some sympathy for that for you too. And I'd reconcile that argument quite easily by saying, well, actually, well, then that's for the individual to choose, and we would make different ethical choices potentially, but we'll leave it for a matter of individual choice. My concern is far more about the practicalities of this argument. I don't ever want anyone to feel coerced into taking their life earlier than they might otherwise do, or when, natural illness would have run its course. I do worry that if not direct coercion, there is a risk of indirect coercion. What if I'm a burden on my family? Oh, I don't want my children to have to worry about me. I don't think palliative care in this country is good enough. There's some brilliant palliative care, but it's far too inconsistent. And I think that might lead to people, again, feeling forced. And there are some bad faith actors out there, including in families. And so for me, there is a real question mark about the practicalities, and also some ethical issues on the practical side as well. I don't think any physician should ever be compelled to perform assisted dying.
Just on the point that he was raising there about being at the bedside of a loved one and thinking, I wish I could end their suffering, I can entirely sympathise with that emotion because I felt it myself over the course of recent weeks. However, ending suffering to mean end life, that's not quite, I think, what loved ones want. They want their patient, they want their relative to just be comfortable. You are in situations in hospitals, and I know we've heard from people on this, and we're going to get to some of the comments that we've received to our columns in a moment. There are moments where your loved one it can be in a huge amount of pain and distress, and I can completely understand the emotion that runs through you that says, please just end this now. But there is also that is a failure of good palliative care. That is a failure of medical management. Maybe because hospitals are overrun or symptoms are too complex to be adequately dealt with. So I get that emotion, but I think we need to distinguish between this sense of ending suffering, i.e. wanting a loved one to die and be out of their misery, and allowing a loved one to die without that pain and suffering, with that pain and suffering adequately managed by medication.
Just the list of things that Wes Streeting puts on the table there in his interview with us before the election, there's been no real discussion of that. We're only 4 or 5 months after a general election, and this very consequential vote is happening on Friday. This issue of coercion, the issue that you raise about hospice funding, end-of-life care, the issue that Tanny Gray-Thompson, the Olympian, raised with us, which is disabled people. And also, what does 6 months to live mean? The legislation, the bill that is being put forward by Kim Leadbeater, is saying that only people with 6 months to live will be able to facilitate any assisted dying support from doctors, and then a judge would have to sign that off. But so many times, 6 months isn't 6 months. Shabana Mahmood, the Justice Secretary, and isn't it worrying, Camilla, I think, for everybody who might be voting for this on Friday, maybe voting in favour of assisted dying, that the Health Secretary says that he is against it. And the Justice Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, she came out at the weekend, she wrote to her constituents and said that she was against it as well. She made the point in that letter, so that's the two departments that will be central to the delivery of assisted dying. The leaders of those departments both say, well, I'm against it. But she made the point, and it leans into the point that Wes Streeting made about bad actors. Hillsborough, infected blood, how many health inquiries have we seen where health inquiries and then things like the post office, there are not benign actors, and the state is often not a benign actor, and it's only after many, many years. Think of infected blood. That is decades before we realised this is a horror show. And the worry has to be, without deep thinking and proper expert evidence, how do we know we're not opening a situation where in 20 years' time we will say, what did we do there?
Should we just listen to where Wes Streeting is on it now? This is him speaking to BBC Breakfast in October.
I think this is a incredibly difficult and complicated issue. This is a free vote. The government doesn't have a view, so MPs are free to vote however they want, whatever their party. And I can tell you, we are all wrestling with this across the political divide. I've made it clear that I'll be voting against the assisted dying bill this time. That's mainly because I don't think that palliative care, end-of-life care, is where it needs to be to give people a real choice. I'm concerned about the risk of people being coerced into taking their lives sooner than they would have liked, or feeling, even without pressure from their families, sometimes guilt-tripped, feeling like a burden. And I've had to weigh up all of those issues. I respect enormously people who've taken a different view, and I think it's a finely balanced judgment. And there are people who I respect and like very much, including Kim Leadbeater, who are taking a different view. And whatever Parliament decides, the government will respect and act upon, including me.
I don't think this has been politically well handled. Keir Starmer did say to Esther Rantzen, probably correctly, and we know that Keir Starmer is sympathetic to the issue of assisted dying, or to supporting assisted dying, although he hasn't said anything because the government has been told not to say anything on this issue, which is slightly ludicrous. He said to Esther Rantzen he would allow for a debate and a vote. Now, he could have done that in a completely different way from the way he has done this. So allowing a private member's bill, which can be talked out, called filibustering, in the 5 hours they have given it, there are all sorts of tricks that can be pulled by either side to get it through the system of the second reading. It's just not considered enough. Keir Starmer, just like he has done, or this government has done with so many different issues, has sort of bundled into this and driven it, allowed it to be driven so quickly to the top of the political agenda. And he's put himself in the position where Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary, because private members' bills should not be influenced by the government, Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary, has had to write to every minister in the government, including all members of the Cabinet, telling them to remain neutral. Well, if a government has just been voted for by the public to be in office, how can they possibly remain neutral on such an issue? The fact that we don't know what the Prime Minister thinks, we don't know what the Chancellor thinks, we don't know what a whole number of elected ministers believe on this issue, leaves the public, although there is support broadly for the idea of assisted dying, about 60 to 65% of people under tightly controlled situations do support assisted dying. There must also be a concern that this is being rushed and is using a second division mechanism, a private members bill, rather than a Premier League way of dealing with this, which would be, as I say, inquiry, proper legislation and proper days of parliamentary debate. So
we're 4 days out from this first vote. Our colleague Janet Eastham has seen a report. So bear in mind, we're hours away practically from making this monumental decision. And a report has come out, which we won't really have time to properly probe and investigate and discuss and debate, suggesting that assisted dying is inherently sexist, that it disproportionately affects women more than men. Now, she's on the verge of publishing this piece, which will be on the Telegraph website later. But even that in itself, and it doesn't actually surprise me, just to hear that anecdotally, that women could be disproportionately affected by this more than men. I suppose that's to reflect the fact that maybe they would be more prone to being coercively controlled, more prone to feeling a burden, perhaps, quite a kind of, feminine trait to sort of not want to trouble others, particularly when it comes to elderly women who may have lost their husbands, more likely to be living longer than their husbands just because of the genetics of it all. But even that one report, which we're writing up journalistically, that's something that you'd want to have at the centre of some sort of public inquiry.
Yeah, exactly. How many things have been revealed in things like Hillsborough, in things like all the health and maternity care disasters that we have spoken about on the Daily Tea podcast, in things that are also in a very different area, the post office inquiry, infected blood. You only find out when people start giving evidence. You say, my goodness me, I didn't know you were doing it like that. I didn't know that was the mechanism that was being used. And the fact that it's being left to journalists, I mean, brilliant work by Janet and many, many others in this area. The fact that it's being left to journalists to find this material out, as you say, just days before the actual vote, it's just not sufficient. And the Prime Minister should get a grip and say, we haven't had sufficient time. I think a big effort will be made on Friday to talk out the bill. People will just say there has not been enough time and this is not a suitable mechanism for such a change.
Before we get on to your comments about this, just in terms of Friday, I've been canvassing various different people in Westminster. I think when this debate first started, I thought that it would just run away with itself and that the vote would pass. I'm not quite sure now, because not only have we got Mahmood and indeed Streeting against, we've also got the likes of the Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson expressing concerns. I know they're meant to have been neutral, but we are kind of getting
Angela Rayner, we've heard from
a growing
a little
impression. Yep. And equally, we've had Sir Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, come out against. That's because he spent a long time caring for his mother, who had a lot of health problems, and he's got a disabled son, John, who he's spoken about in the past very movingly. So I think he shares Tanny Gray Thompson's fears about how the disabled might be badly affected by this proposed legislation. But I was speaking to somebody in Westminster yesterday on the show, and they were saying, yeah, but if you add up some of the younger Labour MPs who, I don't know, maybe I'm making generalisations, but may not have witnessed an elderly relative or a relative going through an end-of-life scenario, and then you add up the Lib Dem MPs in general who aren't necessarily on the same page as Davey, you consider that large majority of Labour, and then you consider that some on the Tory side might be for it rather than against it, then it does suggest that if it isn't filibustered out, that it could pass.
Yes, but Friday is a desolate day in Parliament. I wonder if a lot of MPs will just not be in the Commons. They won't be in the chamber. And then they don't need to say to their constituents which way they voted. Or they may abstain. And that might be a way of stopping what's called the closure motion. A private member's bill needs to have a closure motion as well as a vote on the substance of the actual legislation. So there are two hurdles to get over. But there could be a situation where they don't even get to what's called the closure motion, because there will not be sufficient number of MPs who vote for that. So again, it comes to this whole point that private members' bill is simply not the mechanism for this.
Well, our producers combed through all of the comments that were left at the bottom of our
Thank you so much.
columns.
Both of us had, thousands really of responses to this, so we do thank you for those.
So let's look at somebody who anonymously commented on your piece, saying the following: a private member's bill with all its shallowness and constraints is not the vehicle for legislation as important as this. I favour the concept within clearly defined and applied boundaries, but only after a proper, thorough, intelligent process leading to the status of law. That is a complete impossibility under the current regime.
I think that's a very powerful point. Let's see one of the responses to your column, Camilla. This is from Krasi Stoyanova, and she says, I have witnessed some deaths that have been so utterly painful that they are etched into my mind. We would never let an animal suffer like this. I have also seen people who have virtually no faculties left and can do absolutely nothing for themselves. They must die a painful, undignified death. Why?
Well, my response to that is that no, they don't need to die a painful and undignified death. And I return to my point about palliative care. In the case of Australia, which I think in the summer provided for all states to provide assisted dying to its peoples, it found out that of half of all intensive care patients in Australian hospitals, only half, even though they were in intensive care, were offered access to good palliative care. So I'm sorry, there is a link up here between a lack of good end-of-life provision and those advocating for assisted dying simply because there doesn't seem to be a better option.
And as we mentioned, Camilla, as I mentioned, this now maps into the rest of the performance of this government. I think I wrote in a column, 2 weeks ago, about this mixture of ignorance and callousness, that the government is is moving too rapidly into subjects which it hasn't given enough thought to. The withdrawal of the winter fuel allowance for many, many pensioners. Inheritance tax, not just on farmers, but on many, many family businesses. And now this issue, which is probably, of greatest effect. You can always reverse a tax change. You can always change a benefit to people. Once you cross the line on this issue, I think Esther Ranson said to us, you're never going to unwind it. And if you put those three things together, if you put together the broken promises that Labour made before the last election on inheritance tax, said that it wouldn't change for farmers, on the increase in taxes, on we won't increase borrowing, all have turned out not to be the case.